Hello, welcome everybody. I am going to do the next couple of lectures with you on social psychology. My name is Joe Forgas and I really hope you will enjoy this class. The topic I'm going to talk to you about in these two lectures is one of the most fascinating aspects of human social behavior, social influence processes. Throughout the lecture, there will be a number of embedded links in the slides to reading material that you might want to look at, and also some videos and talks that are relevant to the topics we are discussing. The objective is to show that social psychology and the study of social influence processes has a direct relevance to the way we understand many aspects of controversial topics in everyday life. The study of social psychology is particularly important if you want to understand everyday social life as it goes on around us. In studying social psychology, we also have to be very aware of the fact that humans evolved as a result of a long evolutionary process, and so many of our social behaviors have been shaped by experiences in previous periods. We also need to look at human history as a record of past patterns of social behavior, which can help us to understand what goes on around us today. It is inevitable that as you study social psychology, some of your pre-existing attitudes and beliefs will be challenged. It's up to you to make up your mind about the various aspects of the social world around you, and social psychology will help you in achieving this. My personal interest in social psychology goes back a very long way. I was actually interested in this discipline from the time when I was in high school. Believe it or not, but the picture you see at the bottom of this slide is me when I was about your age at 22. I had a fairly adventurous background. I was born in Hungary, if you wonder about the accent that I have. And if you want to see about some of my early adventures, click on the link on the slide and have a look at that short video. These two lectures will focus specifically on social influence processes. Social influence is all around us. If you think about it, ask yourself this question. Have you ever believed something that you heard secondhand? Or did you ever do something that a parent or a teacher told you to do? Have you ever laughed at a joke just because others did, even though you didn't understand it? Have you ever bought products simply because they were advertised? Or did you ever wear clothes that didn't suit you just because they are fashionable and others wear them? These are all examples of social influence processes in everyday life. Human social behavior, like the behavior of every other species, is partly shaped by evolutionary forces. The survival of humans as a species owes a great deal to our unparalleled ability to cooperate with each other and share knowledge, share our thinking, and to engage in well-coordinated group behaviors. Our survival is mainly due to this incredible ability. Many of the social influence processes that we're going to look at are universal across different cultures, which suggests that there is a universal tendency for people to behave in that way. Conformity, obedience, and the group mind are pretty typical of every human culture we know in every historical period. If you are interested in the evolution of social behavior, I recommend that you look at the book by Bill von Hippel, who was a colleague of mine and is now at Queensland University, The Social Leap, or click on the link and watch him talk about his research on the evolutionary origins of social behavior. Evolutionary social psychologists argue that the human brain essentially evolved to manage our social relationships and coordinate groups because throughout our history, group cooperation was the necessary requirement for survival. As a consequence, humans have a very strong need for belonging, status, and identity, which they can only achieve by associating with meaningful social groups. Evolutionary ideas about human social behavior are extremely interesting, and I recommend that you click on the link to Steven Pinker's conversation about human nature, and better still, read his excellent book, How the Mind Works, which is a summary of a theory of human evolution and its effects on human psychology. The notion that the human brain is essentially a product of social development was supported by research by Robin Dunbar at Oxford University, who studied the relationship between brain size and group size in a number of different primate species. Dunbar found that there is a very close association between brain size and group size. The bigger the group, the larger the brain required to coordinate behavior. Humans have the largest brain, and according to Dunbar, the typical social group that our brains are capable of coordinating is about 150 people. 150 has been called Dunbar's number, and there is historical evidence that, in fact, the typical size of human groups has been about 150 for a very long time. Stone Age hunting-gathering tribes, medieval villages, and the basic units of most military units are about 150 people. Dunbar also found that the average size of meaningful contacts that people maintain on Facebook is about 150, and the average English family keeps in touch with about 150 others by Christmas cards, for example. So the idea is that the human brain's cognitive capacity evolved in the service of social interaction and integrating our social groups. Humans are a profoundly social species. To appreciate it, just imagine a life in which you are the only living person on Earth and there is nobody else around you alive. What would it be like to be you? If you think about it, it turns out that you would not be anything like the person you can be now. You would have no language, you would have no shared information from anybody, you would have no culture or norms, you wouldn't have any information about how to behave. Effectively, you would be in a desperate situation, unrecognizable as a human being. Experiments on social isolation show that most people find enforced isolation extremely aversive and painful and will want to get out of isolation as soon as possible. The recent COVID epidemic is a good example of how enforced isolation can be extremely damaging to people. Extreme enforced isolation can be used to almost completely change a person's personality. This was found in the brainwashing studies in the 1950s when psychologists examined American soldiers who were captured in the Korean War and were kept in complete isolation by Chinese military men in their re-education camps. They found that when the soldiers returned to the United States eventually, they were almost completely changed in terms of their personality, habits, and customs. The same strategy is used even today in China in the re-education camps, which are used to brainwash, to change the behavior, values, and attitudes of people who do not agree with the ideology of the Chinese Communist Party. Social influence is all around us and comes from many different sources. Some of the influences we are exposed to come from outside, from people we are not very closely related to. Celebrities, writers, newspapers, radio stations can have a relatively weak influence on a very large number of people. On the other hand, intimately known others, friends and family, have a great deal of influence, but relatively on a small number of people. So we can discriminate social influence processes in terms of the strength of the influence and also the reach of the influence, how many people it can access. Now, in these lectures, we are going to look at 5 different kinds of social influence processes in more detail. We're going to look at mere presence effects. This is the kind of social influence that occurs simply because people are in the same space and time for a period. We're going to look at conformity. We're going to look at obedience. We're going to look at compliance. And we're going to look at social influence due to group membership. We are going to start by looking at the simplest form of social influence, mere presence and audience effects. These occur when people simply share each other's company in time and space without actually attempting to directly influence each other at all. If you look at the picture, it sort of illustrates that minimal social influence situation. The first experiment in social psychology was carried out by Triplett in 1898. He wasn't actually interested in studying social influence processes, he was interested in motor performance. He noticed that when you ask a person to perform a simple motor task, for example, pedal a bicycle, and try as hard as they can, when they do it alone, they are not doing as well as in a situation when there is another person doing the same task. Triplett reasoned that the presence of other people might produce an improvement in motor performance. This has been called the dynamogenic factor theory. The presence of others is a stimulus that arouses the competitive instinct. Triplett, in an experimental setting, found support for this hypothesis when he asked individuals to perform a simple motor task, for example, wind up fishing lines onto a fishing reel. And it turned out that people are doing significantly better when they're not alone in the room, but other people are doing the same task next to them. Social facilitation effects occur in other species as well, not only in humans. In an interesting study, Bayer in 1929 showed that if you allow a chicken to eat as much as it wants and measure the amount, and then you introduce another chicken into the same area, the originally full chicken continues to eat 2/3 as much again. The presence of another chicken automatically results in a huge increase in the amount of food that the chicken consumes. Similar facilitation effects can also occur in humans. People tend to eat more when in company with other people than the amount they eat when they happen to be alone. A very similar effect to what has been shown with chickens in the previous experiment. Also. Now, how do we explain this kind of mysterious effect that having other people there will have an influence on our behavior even though we're not even consciously aware of it? Floyd Allport in 1924 called this social facilitation, the facilitation of behavior as a result of the influence of other people being present and observing us or doing the same. However, it pretty soon turned out that having other people in the same space is not always a facilitatory effect. On certain tasks, especially new, difficult, unfamiliar tasks, the opposite was found. Having other people there has an inhibitory effect. People do less well when other people are there as well. So here you have two empirical observations, apparently inconsistent with each other. Some tasks are done better in the company of other people, and other tasks are inhibited in the company of other people. How do we explain this? It was not until 1965 that Robert Zions proposed a theory explaining the strange dual effect of social facilitation and social inhibition. He called this a drive theory, and what he predicted is the following. The arousal produced by the presence of other people tends to increase performance on dominant responses. If the dominant response happens to be correct, then we call it facilitation. If the dominant response happens to be incorrect, then we call it social inhibition. In other words, whatever you do well, whatever you are highly skilled at, will be improved by being observed by others, doing it in the company of others. But whatever you are not practiced in doing, whatever is an unfamiliar task, will tend to be inhibited in the presence of other people. This figure presents a summary of Zion's drive theory or arousal theory. The mere presence of others, according to Zajons, produces an arousal state, and the arousal state facilitates the performance of the dominant response. If the dominant response is the correct one, then there is going to be facilitation. If the dominant response is not the correct one, there is going to be social inhibition. There is some fascinating evidence supporting Zion's arousal or drive theory. In a 1969 study, Zion's used cockroaches as the subject of this experiment. For cockroaches, the dominant task when you turn on a light is to run away in a straight line. Zion's created two kinds of situations. In one situation, running in a straight line helped the cockroach to avoid the light and get into a dark place. That was the easy, dominant task. In the other situation, the cockroach had to turn a corner to escape the light. That was the difficult, non-dominant response. He also manipulated the presence of an audience. In one condition, there were other cockroaches watching the performance of the subject from a divided plastic transparent chamber. In the other condition, the cockroaches performed the task alone. Zajons found, as predicted, that the dominant response running in a straight line was facilitated by the presence of an audience. The non-dominant response, having to turn a corner, was inhibited by the presence of an audience. In other words, the cockroaches did better alone when the task was difficult and did better with an audience when the task was easy. Social facilitation occurs in everyday life in many situations, and usually people are not even aware of it. In one interesting study, TAR found that drivers will speed off significantly faster at an intersection when the light changes to green when there happens to be another driver next to them. In other words, just having somebody there has this spontaneous influence on increasing the speed of crossing the intersection. In another experiment carried out at this university in the gym at the squash courts, we manipulated the presence or the absence of an audience observing squash players. And we found that when there is an audience, squash players tend to coordinate their game significantly better, especially when they are highly competent. In other words, an audience facilitates the performance of the players. Another very common consequence of minimal social influence is called social loafing. This is what happens when people perform a task together in such a way that their individual input cannot be monitored and identified. In those situations, people tend to put in less effort than they do at situations when they work independently and alone. People slack off in such situations probably for two reasons. Firstly, low expectancy. They realize that working hard as an individual is not going to make much of a difference to the performance of the group. And low instrumentality, because they know that nobody will notice it anyway. This effect was first identified by Ringelmann using a very simple experiment. He asked people to pull as hard as they can on a rope and measured their input. He then asked people to work together, and several of the subjects were pulling on the single rope. If they were trying as hard as they did before, you would find that their effort will be the total of their individual best performance. But in fact, what Ringelmann found was that the more people you put together to work on the same task, the less each individual will make a genuine effort. You can see this on the bottom right-hand figure. The larger of the number of the people who work together, the greater the decline in individual performance. This is a social loafing effect. This can be very important in industrial and organizational settings because we want people to do their best, and there is a significant loss if people slack off. In organizational settings, the typical response to reduce social loafing is to try to increase the relevance and the commitment to the task, try to construct situations where individual performance can be identified, and try to increase the cohesiveness of the group so people care more about the total group performance and are less likely to engage in social loafing. Now let's move on now to another very important process of social influence, and that is conformity. Conformity is also a universal tendency. We all are influenced by the behavior of others and the behavior of groups, and we tend to spontaneously adapt to the expected standards. For the purposes of this discussion, we could define conformity as a situation when we adhere to or adjust our thoughts, feelings, and/or behaviors to be consistent with the standards of a group or society with which we are associated. The human tendency to conform is universal, and even people who pride themselves on being nonconformist, for example punks, actually conform to the norms and expectations of their own reference groups. Almost everybody conforms to some standard, whether it's the majority standard or a minority standard, it still involves conformity. Conformity is in some ways a dirty word. Nobody is proud to be conformist. We don't like to think of ourselves as rugged individualists. But in fact, conformity is essential for any kind of effective social organization. If everybody behaved in a way that takes no account of what other people are doing, all social life would become possible. Even traffic, the ability of cars to move on the road, is based on conformity. We have to obey and follow certain rules which other people follow as well. If everybody just drove wherever they want to drive, whichever side of the road, traffic rapidly would be impossible. And the same can be said about all forms of social living. A university lecture would be impossible if students and teachers did not conform to the expectations that apply to that particular situation. As we have seen, the tendency to conform and behave as other people do appears to be an almost universal human characteristic and also essential for running a well-functioning society or group. The universality of conformity has long been observed by social scientists. For example, Ross argued that the tendency to imitate appears to be a universal human characteristic, and sociologists like Le Bon and Todd over 100 years ago observed that when people find themselves in a crowd situation, it appears that they almost lose their sense of individual volition and act as if they were a single organism. In the last few decades, some neuropsychological evidence seems to back up the notion that conformity is deeply embedded in the human brain. Neuroscientists discovered certain neurons, mirror neurons, which fire when we observe an action being performed by another person. And these neurons tend to be the same neurons that we use when we ourselves perform exactly the same action. So it seems like these neurons specialize in preparing the organism to do as others do. It is basically a neurological basis of an automatic tendency to imitate. There's also suggestions that damage to mirror neurons might be linked to certain disorders, for example, autism. Autism involves a lack of ability or a weakened ability to coordinate your behavior with other people. One of the classic studies in conformity was carried out by Muzaffer Sherif in the 1930s. In this study, participants were asked to sit in a dark room and estimate the distance that a single solitary light source was appeared to be moving. Actually, the light source didn't move at all. This was a perceptual illusion, so there was no correct judgment and the situation was inherently ambiguous. All that happened is that you hear other people making judgments which may be different or similar to yours, but you have no objective way to determine what the correct judgment should be. In this ambiguous situation, Sherif observed a very curious phenomenon. When people are exposed to hearing the opinions of others, then gradually they spontaneously change their judgments to be more similar to what other people are thinking. So if you look at the graph, judgments when made alone show a great deal of divergence. Some people make a large decision and others make small ones. But when you put people together into the same room and they simply hear that different people have different judgments, as the experiment goes on, in the first, second, and third group session, judgments tend to spontaneously coalesce towards a group mean. What this shows is that in ambiguous situations, human beings are inherently and automatically inclined to develop, to establish a common shared norm. It's almost as if human beings like to have a consensus, an agreement about how a particular situation should be interpreted. We feel uncomfortable when there are different opinions. We go out of our way to try to agree. This fundamental process of norm formation demonstrated by Sherif also has some other important implications. Jacobs and Campbell in 1961 used a very similar procedure, but this time, after the norm has been established, he removed the participants one at a time until all the participants in the room were several generations removed from the original establishment of the norm. But Jacobs and Campbell found that people will stick to the previously established norm even if they have no knowledge and no understanding as to how it came about and how it was initially established. The Jacobs and Campbell study shows that another fundamental feature of human nature is that we are conservative when it comes to maintaining norms. Once there is a way of doing something for whatever reason, we tend to stick to it and stay with that particular custom in the first place. Now bear in mind this one form of conformity before we look at another kind of classic conformity experiment, which was carried out by Solomon Asch in 1952. This is again an experiment that was presented as a social perception experiment. Participants had a simple task of estimating which of the standard line is the same as three comparison lines. As you can see here, line number 2 is obviously the same length as the standard line. It's a very easy task that everybody gets right alone all the time. This is the way the experiment looked like in the 1950s. Actually, what Solomon Asch did is manipulate the situation by getting one real participant, this one, and several, up to 6, stooges who were collaborators of the experimenter. As the experiment started, the experimenter called out the participants one at a time. starting at the far end. And each of these participants made an incorrect judgment. Now imagine yourself that you are the participant sitting here, and as the experiment proceeds, all these people are giving an obviously incorrect answer. Soon it will be your turn, and the experimenter will ask you your judgment. So you're in a quandary. Will you call out the correct answer, which in this case is B or 2, or will you stick to your guns, or will you be influenced by what the other participants have said, just so you do not deviate from the group? What Ash found was that a high percentage of participants go along with what other people say, despite the fact that they know perfectly well that it's the incorrect answer. So in the Ash paradigm, when the norms are completely clear, it's not like the sheriff situation where the judgments are ambiguous. What turns out to be the case is that 35% of the participants conform even though they know that they are making an incorrect judgment. Only about 25% stick to their guns and call out the correct answer, but they feel stressed, they feel upset because they know that they have gone against the judgment of the majority. Ash found that the tendency to conform was partly dependent on how ambiguous the lines were. The closer they were to each other, the easier it was to make a mistake, the greater the conformity, the more people tended to go along with the group. Later experiments showed that there are a number of variables which tend to promote conformity in this sort of situation. For example, when people feel incompetent or insecure, they conform more. The size of the group matters. You have to have at least 3 people making an incorrect judgment for conformity to occur. When you have a high respect for the group, when you admire the group, conformity will increase. If you don't have any prior commitment to any response, again conformity will be stronger. When you are being observed, conformity occurs. When you can make a judgment without being observed, in other words, you are in anonymity, more people will give the correct answer. It's also interesting that the tendency to conform in the Ash situation partly depends on the particular culture in which you live. Studies shown that if you compare conformity across France and Norway, the French conform less than the Norwegians. And the explanation for that is that Norway at that time was a very homogeneous, very strongly conformist culture where people felt more awkward about going against the group, whereas France was considered a more individualistic culture where people were less upset about going against the group. The unanimity of the group is also very important. If there is a single person who doesn't conform, that breaks down the tendency to conform very strongly. So if you have one other person before you who gives the correct answer, then the real participant is much less likely to conform as well. It is important to understand different kinds of conformity pressures that occur in the sheriff and the Ash situation. In the sheriff situation, when people have to judge an ambiguous stimulus, the illusory movement of a light source, other people's judgments might represent information that tells you what the correct answer might be. And if you accept that information, there is a private acceptance of the group norm. So participants continue to maintain the judgment that was formed as a result of hearing what others have to say. In the Ash situation, it's a completely different kind of conformity because here the correct response is clear. Everybody can see which is the correct answer to the length of lines question. So people conform in the Ash situation for a different reason. It's called normative social influence. They conform because they don't want to be different from other members of the group. In this situation, the conformity is only temporary. It's public compliance to a group norm, but the individual's private beliefs do not change. They continue to make correct judgments when they have an opportunity to do so alone. So these two different kinds of social influence can be described as informational influence, when we conform to others because we believe that they have more accurate information, and normative influence when we conform to others because we want them to like us and accept us, but we do not necessarily agree with their opinions. In everyday life, there are many situations where people conform to behaviors simply because they observe other people doing it. One interesting study in this domain was carried out by Leon Mann, an Australian social psychologist, who studied the extent to which people will join a bus queue depending on how many people are already queuing. In some cultures, like in England, people automatically queue. In other cultures, like Israel, they do not. Leon Mann found that in Jerusalem, when you have 2, 4, 6 or 8 people queuing at the bus stop, a newcomer will only join the end of the queue when there are already 6 or 8 people standing in line. If there are only 2 or 4 people standing, they will not conform. So the size of the group has a significant effect on conformity. Conformity to the shared beliefs of a group can be so powerful that it can even influence scientific decisions and academic decision making. This was shown by Alan Sokol, a physicist, who wanted to test the possibility that in certain fields of social science, completely meaningless, intentionally nonsense academic papers will be accepted for publication if they conform to the ideology and the beliefs of that particular group of researchers. He wrote and submitted an intentionally gibberish nonsense paper to a postmodernist academic journal called Social Text, where it was promptly accepted and published. The paper used language that made absolutely no sense, but it came to the expected conclusions that agreed with the editorial beliefs of the paper. The same kind of situation was repeated more recently by 3 researchers, Lindsay, Plakos and Bogosian, who wrote 20 fake papers in a completely incomprehensible postmodernist jargon and submitted these papers to journals in different fields of gender studies, grievance studies, and so on. 7 of the papers were promptly accepted, 6 were still under review, and 7 were rejected when the study had to be discontinued because the hoax became publicly known. What these 2 studies show is that when a particular group has a very strong set of beliefs and has an idealistic perception of their purpose, then rationality disappears and conformity to the ideological dogmas of a particular field will become more powerful than seeking reality or seeking truth. The kind of conformity studies we described are all situations where a person conforms spontaneously even though there is no explicit demand to conform. Another powerful example of this kind of conformity is when people's behavior is regulated by what they expect to be the norms in the situation. This conformity, situational conformity, was illustrated in the famous study by Philip Zimbardo, the Stanford Prison Simulation Study, where normal Stanford undergraduate students were randomly assigned to play the role of either prison guards or prisoners. And basically, this role-playing situation within a few days completely got out of hand to such an extent that the prison guards started to conform to what their perception of the prison guard role involved, and they behaved in violent, cruel, and nasty ways towards the prisoners. The prisoners in turn essentially took on the role, which became reality for them, and they showed signs of psychological distress. So Zimbardo had to discontinue the simulation before its allocated time. Watch the video on the Stanford prison simulation. This is one of the classic illustrations of how people will conform to the expectations of a situation. It also makes the point that role play often becomes real. If you engage in a role play situation, if it continues for any length of time, you will conform to your perception of what the role demands, and it will be reality. Now, there are even more extreme cases of people conforming to situational influences, as we shall see in the next slide. It is also Philip Zimbardo who coined the term de-individuation to describe extreme situations where human beings will behave in ways that is totally inconsistent with their normal standards of behavior. If you find yourself in a large group, if you are emotionally involved, if you have anonymity, then the influence of the group can be so powerful that people end up behaving in totally inappropriate ways. According to Zimbardo, de-individuation is particularly likely to occur when people experience anonymity, arousal, and the diffusion of responsibility where they perceive that their individual actions will remain without consequences. Riots, vandalism, terrorism, extreme political action are good examples of de-individuated collective behavior. Now, so far we spoke about spontaneous conformity, when you are swept along by the situation. In other situations, when you are actually a member of a cohesive, well-functioning group, then conformity pressures might be even stronger. Janis, a social psychologist, coined the term groupthink to describe a situation where an individual is totally dominated by the opinions of the group to which they belong. Janis defined groupthink as a mode of thinking that people engage in when they are deeply involved in a cohesive in-group, when the members' strivings for unanimity override their motivation to realistically appraise alternative courses of action. In other words, you give up your individual rational decision-making in order to be a member of a group. In groupthink situations, consensus and agreement is more important than reality. Group members ignore disconfirming information. They actively suppress dissent, anybody who thinks differently. They insist that everybody must think alike. Groups also use what Janis called mind guards. These are individuals in the group who take on the responsibility for filtering information and controlling dissent in order to maintain the homogeneity of group beliefs. Groupthink sometimes can take on extreme forms when people come to believe completely absurd or ridiculous theories simply because other members of the group they belong to already believe them. Conspiracy theories often spread that way. People in a particular internet group tend to read the same information and confirm each other's views. The QAnon conspiracy, which is a famous recent conspiracy, people who believe that conspiracy believe that pedophiles drinking children's blood run the United States from a pizza restaurant in Washington, and that this cult is led by Hillary Clinton. Now, you might think that this is such a crazy conspiracy theory that no sane person would believe it, but apparently hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of Americans are convinced that this is true. Click and watch the film on the QAnon conspiracy on the web link. Group conformity can play a very important role in maintaining fictitious belief systems in many civilizations, sometimes enduring for hundreds of years. Here is a list of some such fictional beliefs. For example, the Aztecs believed that you have to cut out the beating hearts of hundreds of captives to please their god. Germans in the Nazi period believed that they are a superior race who are destined to subjugate others. Marxists believe that a proletarian revolution will lead to a perfect communist society. During the Inquisition, those who questioned religion were burnt on the stake. Christians believe in the virgin birth. In Islam, people believe that male martyrs will be rewarded with 72 virgins in paradise. And in Judaism, you are prohibited to eat milk and meat in the same meal. These are all examples of fictitious beliefs that are supported by group conformity pressures. As we have seen, conformity is a very powerful tendency in humans, and people often conform to others even when there is no explicit expectation or demand to do so. However, the power of conformity can also be broken sometimes when there is a single person who doesn't conform. A single individual who refuses to go along with the group can break the power of conformity. Research on conformity also has some important social implications. The human tendency to agree with others and to silence dissenting opinions must be limited if we want to get an informed and useful debate. One of the foundational values of liberal democracy is never to suppress minority opinions, because if a dissenter is right, you will learn something, and if they are wrong, the challenge will help you to reinforce your correct opinions. The philosopher who has written on this is John Stuart Mill, who argued that under no circumstances should an individual opinion be oppressed by the majority or by the state. Click on the link and watch a brief video on John Stuart Mill's foundational work on liberty. As we have seen, conformity plays a very important role in human social behavior, and it has both positive and negative consequences. Among the positive consequences, we might mention that conformity gives structure to social life, it gives predictability, it allows coordination, and sometimes it can be used in a beneficial way in clinical psychology, for example, using group pressure or group conformity to achieve behavior change, as happens, for example, in Alcoholics Anonymous, when the group is an agent of giving up drinking. Conformity, however, also has some negative consequences. The tyranny of group opinions often results in individuals losing their sense of autonomy and independence, and when the group's beliefs are irrational, then it can have very damaging consequences in reinforcing irrational and maladaptive behavior, as we have seen in several of the examples we considered. What's also interesting is that sometimes repeated exposure can also lead to conformity. In an interesting study, Weaver and others in 2007 showed that hearing the same opinion 3 times from the same person, can be almost as effective in inducing conformity as hearing 3 different people voice the same opinion, as in the Ash situation. So simply repeating a claim multiple times does produce a tendency to believe it and to conform. This is a very important strategy in political propaganda. Goebbels, the propaganda minister in Nazi Germany, is credited with inventing the power of repeated simple claims until people start to believe it. The more you repeat it, the more it will appear to be true. Once again, Donald Trump's repeated claims that he won the election may have contributed to the tendency of others to believe that it could be true simply because he repeated it so many times. Given the very powerful effects of conformity on stifling individual expression, it's very important to learn some strategies to combat the pressure to conform. It's important for people to seek autonomy and authenticity. It's also very important never to be absolutely convinced that in any opinion or attitude you are perfectly right. Always be willing to consider alternatives. On the other side, groups need to learn how to handle dissent, and members of groups need to have a courage to present their own opinions. We have all experienced that deviation from a group can be risky and unpleasant, but if we give in to group pressure all the time, we tend to lose our sense of individuality. It's very important also that groups do not become distorted by conformity pressures, and therefore individuals who care about their groups should take it upon themselves to voice dissenting opinions if they believe it to be correct. Now, at the end of this lecture, I'd like to call your attention to some interesting reading. There are 4 books here which I particularly recommend that you look at. If you're interested in human sociability, the social life of individuals, the way social influence processes work, these are wonderful books to look at. And there is a link so you can look them up. And there are some additional books at the bottom of this slide. In addition, I want to recommend to you a very interesting website on YouTube called The School of Life. This is a website that contains a large number of fascinating and interesting videos which are highly relevant to social psychology and understanding human social behavior. For example, there are brief 5-10 minute, very entertaining, enjoyable, often funny videos on things like cultural history, social issues, social psychology, economics, as well as philosophy and literature. And these are all worth to look at, even if you just want to have a little break in your study and have a little entertaining interval. I recommend them to you. We're going to continue with the second lecture on social influence processes next.